starting. So hi everyone, and thank you again for joining us for our series of learning and knowing more about support programs that exist for both those who have experienced violence and those who may have been a part of causing harm in someone's life. So I am here today with a few of our local program organizers, and they're going to introduce themselves. That's why I'm not saying their name yet. But my name is Zaisha Nadler. I am the Violence Prevention, Education, and Outreach Coordinator here at the Title IX office at SUNY Plattsburgh. And I thank you so much for joining us today in this series. And I hope you take time to look at all of the videos to really explore the options of programs and how to get involved. So now I'm going to just introduce my guests for today. I don't know which one of you want to start first, but whoever does can. Just introduce yourself, your name, pronouns, and title.
I'll start alphabetically. We both have double initials. I never realized that till right now. But my name is Bonnie Black. I'm the coordinator of the PACT program. That stands for Personal Accountability for Changing Tomorrow. And I use she, her, hers. And I graduated twice from Plattsburgh State.
Hi, I'm Stan Stabin. I am a PACT facilitator. I'm also a full-time instructor at SUNY Plattsburgh in the Sociology department, but today I am here officially in my capacity through PACT.
Thank you. So would you please share a little bit more about PACT, what it is, and what its purpose in the community is?
Well, it's a better accountability program for men who perpetrate violence toward their partners. And our objective is to teach and foster non-abusive and non-controlling behavior over the 36 weeks that someone is in the program.
I would also add to that domestic violence issues, it's not necessarily limited just to partner violence. It also encompasses child abuse as well. Some of our clients are there for that reason. So we cast a wide net in terms of addressing domestic violence issues.
Right, because even though our reason for existence is to end violence toward women, it's really to end violence toward women and children, because children learn what they observe. And almost to a person, when I do an intake with someone, one of the questions is, what kind of violence did you see in your childhood and who perpetrated it on whom? And it is very much from evidence, a learned behavior.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Completely agree, obviously. But nonetheless, there is a lot of people, and I'm sure both of you have probably heard it in doing this work, who don't believe people can change and don't believe that these opportunities really exist. So could you speak a little bit to that, and also to what made you, because people probably are like, well, why would you want to do that anyway, right? Why would you want to help someone who's hurt other people? So can you tell us a little bit about what made you decide to work and volunteer with this program?
Stan, why don't you go first on this one?
Well, I can speak, I think, to both Bonnie and my involvement. Bonnie has been amazing in that this is the program has evolved. Pat Harford's involvement was for about 20 years, and it was called VIP. And as always is the case, oftentimes with social services, funding was lost. So we had to reorganize and recalibrate, and it became PACT. And Bonnie really was our savior. She came right in, and as the force of nature that she is, we were able to rebrand, we were able to get back on track and move PACT in this direction. My involvement came as, in fact, Autumn. Autumn was the person that made me aware of VIP, said that they were looking for a male facilitator, and I met with Pat and I forget her name at the time. What was it, Bonnie?
Megan or Vanessa?
Megan, yes. I met with both of them. I really felt it was a great program. And as you know, Zayasia, the work that I do on campus focuses heavily on domestic violence and sexual violence of women in the context of gender apartheid. So it was a great fit for me. It was new for me. But one of the things that I find most exciting for myself is when I teach my classes, particularly sociology of women on campus, people see women in the title and there are no men or very few men that will take it because of the way that they've been socialized in our culture, that, oh, that class isn't for me, or that in some way it will impugn their masculinity if they take a course like that. So oftentimes what I have in the classes that I teach is a sort of singing to the choir, where it's mostly feminist-oriented people, mostly people who want to be agents for social justice. And in this way, the work that I do in PACT, I get to educate people who are the furthest from that side. And what's most rewarding is, and you don't necessarily reach everybody, but you can reach some. And when that happens, because we always say when we discuss the work that we do, it's usually about halfway through that we start to see our clients, the men in group, have epiphanies, where it starts to sink in and they start to see, I think, what we're talking about in the information that we're giving them, but it's influencing their perspective. And that's very, very rewarding. So I would say that that sums up how I got involved. And I do believe that change is possible because I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen through our work.
Definitely, definitely. And I actually first began in this program when it was going to fold in 1995. And the executive director of the Mental Health Association, for whom I worked at that point, where VIP actually began, turned to me and moved me from the employee assistance program, which I had been in about a year. And she said, I'd like you to coordinate and, in essence, strengthen this batterers program, because our community, as well as many, well, all communities need a batterers accountability program. So I did that for a little over a year until I found a person who had a bachelor's in social work, and I hired her to coordinate the program. Meanwhile, we had very solid facilitators. We were doing it 2 evenings a week, and we were getting good referrals. I go back to EAS. I spend my time directing that, still do. That's another program that I do. But then when it financially began to lag a little bit, because this is a self-funded program now. There are no grants, which I wish we had. There are no grants right now. There really is no funding source in Clinton County at all for this. Although we do get some support when DSS refers someone, they may assist with the weekly fee that the person needs to pay to be a part of the program. And so we do operate on a shoestring. It cannot fund a full-time coordinator at this point in time and still make it financially feasible for many of the men who need to participate. And I say need to because the majority of the people we have are actually part of probation. It's a condition of probation or a condition of parole or child protective through Department of Social Services has put this a lot from a family court judge saying you must participate in PACT. So it is not initially necessarily their choice. Although we do have some men in the program who have come to us voluntarily. They've recognized that what they're doing to their partner and or their children just doesn't jibe with their true values, but somehow behaviors have been evidenced where they themselves don't like what they're doing. But most of the men who do participate, and I keep saying men, because this is a batterers program for the male batterer. Statistically, 4% of domestic violence is perpetrated by females, either on females or on males or whatever you identify as. Because of only 4%, with 96% being men, to be very honest, in a rural community like ours, statistically, when we look at the cases that come through family court, the cases that come through intimate domestic violence hearings are mainly men who are the batterers, who have perpetrated the violence on their partner.
And we always say in group, we are well aware that women are capable of using violence, but we strengthen our resolve to communicate with the statistics that Bonnie just referred to, but also that our focus is on men.
Right.
And that's where that's where that focus has to stay.
Yeah.
Because what we, especially at the start of the process for the men that are in group, they have a tendency to either blame, minimize, or deny, and it's usually a combination of all three, quite frankly.
Yes.
And we're very quick to tell them, no, we don't want to hear how someone pushed your buttons.
Yep.
We don't want to hear, that's not what group is for. And that's why the A in our acronym of PACT, accountability, is so important. The focus has to be on them and the violence that they have used, the choices that they have made.
Some people question 36 weeks. Isn't that a long period of time? Well, to be very honest, back in the 90s, when we first were doing what is called the Duluth model, and we were in lockstep with that model at that point, it has evolved as we have evolved. 26 weeks is not long enough. And little by little, PACT began to grow the program longer. For instance, one of the themes, one of the units is children. And it originally, back in the 90s, was 3 weeks long. It's now 6 weeks long, focusing on children. Yet we bring children in throughout the curriculum. And especially in that accountability aspect, relating to what the perpetrator says. Now, one of the things that even the men are not aware of, or even the referral sources necessarily, is that as the coordinator of the program, I do all the intakes. I interface with parole, probation, the courts, DSS, etc. Our facilitators do not know the person's history. They accept everybody in orientation equitably, non-judgmentally, but of course knowing that they're in the program for a reason. I wouldn't have accepted the person unless they met the criteria for the program. But they don't know the personal histories. And it's not that point. The point is for the man to be, period. And what our facilitators do is throughout the 36 weeks, they actually strive for that accountability continuously, right from day one at the orientation before they even sit in their first group. And I've noticed over time that until someone gets about 10 to 12 weeks, their mouth may be saying things, but their ideology has not begun to shift. And it's about a third of the way into the program, which years ago used to be about halfway. Do you begin to see some of that shift when it gets broken down to what was your action? What was the behavior you chose to take? What was the impact on other people? And what beliefs drove that action? Now, what could change? If you could hit the rewind button, what could change in that flow? And the wonderful thing to hear about is when it's the other men in group that hold the person accountable. That's when we see growth in those other men and say, no, don't you understand what you did was? And the facilitator is literally that, just facilitating the conversation that's happening on the floor.
Yeah, that just happened for us the other night in group.
Yes.
Where other men held accountable.
That's just so rewarding. It just continues to validate so much work. And because I completely agree, Bonnie, there are times where even not even a batterer, we'll see people say what they think we want to hear.
Oh yeah.
In order to get out. Just check the box, all right, so I'm gonna be good, right? And continue on. But really that accountability piece is like essential, because it'll maintain and help them keep that behavior and that mindset moving forward, and always be like a bug in their ear.
Well, we always say that when any of the men complete the 36 weeks, we say, as long as you don't reoffend, you are welcome to come back free of charge. You will no longer have to pay. You can come back for a tune-up. You can come back. And we also, and I think it's important to also stress that what we do is not therapy.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Counseling. It is education. Okay. There may be, I think some of the men absolutely experience a therapeutic consequence or side effect to what we do.
Yeah.
But we make it very clear, we're not therapists, we're not your counselors, we're here to educate you. And if through that process, you're able to be more self-reflective, you're able to be able to accept accountability and responsibility for the choices that you've made, hey, that's great, that's what we're here for. We have a few men coming up that are going to complete, and I'm not going to disclose, obviously, anything that's said in group, but one of the men that is going to be completing I've seen the progress that he has made.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would be appropriate to disclose that, that when some men complete, you hate to see them go, because they've stepped up to the plate. They've stepped up into that leadership role, where it's not just the facilitators that are holding the men accountable, that there are people, and Bonnie and I have talked, and I think it's a great idea. We're going to be inviting some of the men that have completed to help us in orientations.
Yes.
So that they're able to pave the way, because really what an orientation is for is to get new clients group ready, to give them the idea of what to expect, to give them the lay of the land in terms of the rules for their behavior in group, consequences for breaking the rules. And sometimes it's like the Charlie Brown teacher, right? A facilitator can be talking and it doesn't sink in, but if a peer, someone that they regard as their peer, is talking to them, that information, I think, can land a little bit more effectively sometimes. So yeah, Bonnie and I have talked about inviting some of our men back to help us with orientation, strictly on a voluntary basis, and the reaction to that has been great. Many of the men are willing. They're even excited about it. Because as part of their own accountability, I think that they've grown into seeing themselves I'm not only going to change myself and continue every day to change myself and make better choices, I want to help other people make better choices now too.
Whenever we see a man turn into an advocate for justice for women and children, we know the job was done well.
Yeah.
And if we can keep the men engaged, whether it be only in orientation, or we've also had a facilitator who worked with us, who completed the program and then came back saying, I want to do this. I want to make a difference, you know, and he's actually what I would call a kind and gentle soul.
Yeah.
And I think he found his kinder side, his soul, actually, by going through the program and having to look in the mirror and reflect on the pretty bad things that he had done. And he was, his actions were not only illegal, but despicable in some cases, you know, and total shift in that human being, which was wonderful.
Yeah.
Love that. Love that. So, and I know we talked about accountability, so that's definitely one. But in terms of like characteristics and things that if someone was looking to be involved and looking to do the same work as we all are, what are some other characteristics that you think are common?
Well, being able to take having emotional intelligence, being self-aware, being aware of your impact on other people, especially those first two emotional intelligence aspects. You must. If you don't have that, you really might be persuaded to believe some things that aren't true. You know.
Yeah. I think that you never, this I'm purely speaking from my point of view and my experience, but I don't really think you can anticipate what you will feel or what your reactions will be until you get involved in this kind of work. I think it's a deep end of the pool kind of thing. And certainly you have the support of a director like Bonnie and your other facilitators. But you have to have a passion to want to do this. You yourself have to be committed to social justice and being an agent of change in our society.
Definitely.
That is essential.
Yeah. And inherently that is being an optimist too. Yes. Things can change.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I believe it. I think it's my sociological side, but what I know to be true, not only from sociological study, but just from hands-on experience, is that the root of violence in our society is the way that we socialize men. I am I'm a true believer in that. I can pull study after study after study after study that will corroborate that.
Yep.
And what Pat Harford always said, that this program and the work that we do is about changing our culture. Mm-hmm. And I absolutely, I support that. I live that. And I also believe it's like dropping a pebble in the pond. You can change, you can drop one pebble at a time and see the reverberation. From one person, there can be enormous change, because you send them out into the world, not only hoping that they will make better choices, but as I said, and Bonnie said, to become an advocate for others. So I think that optimism, that passion has to be there. But then you also have to have the resilience from doing this work to know that you're not going to reach everybody, and not let that discourage you from the work that is vitally important to the community and to the world, frankly. And I think, you know, what Bonnie said is absolutely true. You have to have the emotional intelligence to understand that after a lifetime of using manipulation and violence to get what you want, right? You're going to that, and I think you made mention of it too, Zayaja, that sometimes they just tell you what you want to hear, and you have to develop the ear to know the difference, to know when, and sometimes you'll never know. But with that emotional intelligence that Bonnie was referring to, you start to see, okay, this person is on a path to change. This person isn't. And like anything else, it's their choice.
Right. And I would just add the word yet, that this person is not on their way yet. Because unless there is an extreme mental health issue with someone, I believe just because we kicked you out of the program once doesn't mean you can't come back. Facilitators may not be thrilled. I face that, and that's okay. But when I reflect and look at the person and the person sitting in front of me, whether it's via Zoom, the way I'm doing intakes now, or even in that orientation, okay, we'll work on it a little bit more before we put him into the 36 weeks, or trust me, I think the person understands from the conversation we had at intake that, yeah, they're mandated. Sure, they have a choice. You can go to prison, or you can lose your kids, or you can be part of this program. Now, what do you want for your long-term solution? Yeah. And the second timer, or in a case we had over a man who completed over a year ago, it was his third time through. He was a very changed person from the first and the second time he attempted to make change in his life. He got it by the third. He had had different life experiences and some different health issues he hadn't had before. And he began to see life differently and his position in life differently. So that's the hope.
And I think that, as I said, you can't be discouraged by that. Like anything else, even men who complete doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to batter again.
Oh, right.
Because this process is a lifelong process. This isn't just a 36-week process. This is about making a commitment to change throughout your entire life. And one thing that COVID really complicated, obviously, for us was it was a big interruption in our weekly group meetings. We were able to get back on track this summer. But one thing that was running through all of our minds that work in the program was, oh gosh, they're not going to have that weekly meeting. And Pat gave me some advice at that time, and she said, yes, it's great that they have a place to come to and a place to talk to other men and to be educated on these issues, but they need to make the choice whether they have a week, because what is, after 36 weeks, they're not necessarily cured, right? They still have to face another 36 years of making right choices. So in a way, Pat educated me to say, well, maybe COVID is the silver lining to COVID is, well, are they going to use what they've learned up until now? That they're not going to have a weekly meeting to come to. And I think what was great was that we had, I think maybe out of the 30 men, we only had one.
We did. We had one who
with a significant issue, and I don't even want to say reoffense, but an issue that that we had to reevaluate his participation.
Right. Because part of participation is also, in essence, you're referred to it like a recovery program, staying clean. In other words, you don't get arrested for anything, even looking at a law enforcement officer cross-eyed or anything. I mean, you don't even get a ticket. Don't be involved with the law enforcement whatsoever. Stay on the straight and narrow in all aspects of your life. And the one person didn't. What he was actually arrested for was not to do with domestic violence.
Yeah. But that's how seriously we take that.
Yeah.
And to Bonnie's point earlier about letting men come back in, I've been doing this now going on 5 years, so I've seen literally hundreds of men come, in the process. There's only 2 that I would really draw my line in the sand and say I won't facilitate. And I think Bonnie understands that because it becomes a safety issue.
It's right.
If they have expressed, and even though it would seem obvious, part of our contract says the use of violence or threats is absolutely, we have to say it formally. But if there's even a perception of a threat to a facilitator in a meeting, then they're gone, and they're gone good, because that becomes a safety issue for us and for the other men. But out of the hundreds of men that I've seen come and go, really, there's only been 2 that I would say, nope, it's me or the highway, because that to me is a safety issue.
Yeah. And that's very clear that the safety of everybody is important.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. And it's just going so well. This is such great information, and so many points you touched on. I'm like, yes, and that, and that, and that. And I think the peer-to-peer education, you touched on it a little bit, and then you talked about culture, and I think that touches on something that we've done in our office to recreate what we had as our peer education program, and now we've revamped it, and now it's in acronyms, PEDAL, like pedal bike. But one of the D stands for dismantling a culture, because again, same as you, we know it's not an individual thing. It's ingrained in our day-to-day actions, our day-to-day life, the way that we speak to people, the way people speak to us, things that it's just ingrained everywhere. So we've changed the name of it to include that, to highlight that, because there's so many times where people come to us and they're like, well, it's a solo issue, it's a solo individual issue. And it's like, no, well, that person behaved that way because they've seen this in the past, or they've seen this on TV, and just in so many places where it's just okay. Like, it's just deemed to be okay in so many ways. But because you're giving so much fabulous and great information, we want to know, because there may be people who may want to get involved, and even if they can't get involved with PACT directly, what are some things that they can do in their day-to-day lives? So if there is opportunity to get involved in PACT, what is it? If not, what can they just do in their day-to-day life?
Well, one thing that I'm very excited about, and again, another COVID complication, we've started the process where my Sociology of Women class at Plattsburgh State, Soc 305, plug. What we're going to be doing and implementing very, very soon, and I'm hoping that the COVID issue is resolved, or at least adequately managed, so that we can get back to some degree of normalcy, is to have, for sociology majors who have completed my Soc of Women class, can earn a 3-credit internship each semester. And Bonnie has even said, hey, why not? Let's do it in the winter and in the summer too.
Right.
So depending upon the logistics of the world and the program itself, I'm hoping at the very least to put one sociology major through an internship each semester, each session. And that will include they will be observing group meetings while facilitating in the group happens. And then they'll also be benefiting from Bonnie's umpteen years of expertise when it comes to everything from administration to social services. So I think it's a win-win. So there is going to be opportunity for students at Plattsburgh State, sociology majors, I should say, at Plattsburgh State, to get involved. And I'm being within the sociology department. That's one, and my involvement in PACT and being the liaison here from PACT to the university. I'm insisting on it be sociology majors. because we want them to have first dibs on
Right. And they would fully understand the whole integrated community approach to
Oh yeah.
domestic violence,
After
because
my social women class, they will.
but then they'll work in the real world
Yes.
also, because it
Yep, I think it froze.
I think Bonnie froze. Yeah.
Yep, I think so too.
Let's see if she comes back.
That's a great opportunity though.
I know, isn't it? I'm really thrilled.
Re-enroll and go back for the major again. Like, can you get 2 bachelor's degrees in the same
Yes, right.
in the same opportunity? I don't.
Well, as you know, Zayasia, it's so important. I just think higher education is moving in a direction where to be certified or to have real world experience, as Bonnie was just saying, is vital. And living in the community that we do, internship opportunities are very limited.
Yep.
They are very, very limited. So I'm super excited to have that opportunity.
Yeah.
And I've got we've got candidates already lined up. We're just again waiting for the COVID to resolve itself in some way, so that it's safe. Obviously, that's the first. I think Bonnie actually got disconnected. Maybe she'll rejoin us. What was the second part of your question? Not only how can they get
what could they do in their day-to-day
lives? Well, safety does come first. Mm-hmm. And what we tell, one of the things that we do and that we started in PACT is an expression called "dude, that's rude." And we got shirts made up. And what that means is that in our day-to-day lives, we can intervene on behalf of women. We can. But safety, your own personal safety, you have to make sure that it's safe to intervene. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to accelerate or exacerbate a tense situation. You just don't. But where we see, and this is so important for men, it's important for everybody, but for men in particular, because men listen to men. So if enough men say, we're not going to accept violence against women, we're not going to accept violence against children, then our culture would change, because men have the power to make that happen, right? Again, one of the men that is completing, and I did get his permission to use this example.
Oh, good.
So I'm not speaking out of school. Mm-hmm. or violating our confidentiality. But one of the men that is completed, who again, I saw make progress, he's a coach. And one of the things that he said during a group session was, I never would have thought that I would be talking like this or thinking this way. But whenever I hear somebody say, while I'm coaching, you throw like a girl, I'm not going to let I'm going to call them on that. I'm not going to let that happen anymore, because it's wrong. Whenever I hear one of my players or a parent from the stands call someone a sissy or say you're throwing like a girl, I'm not going to allow that anymore. So that's what, to me, people can do in their day-to-day lives. Mm-hmm. I remember an experience that I had at Lowe's after I bought my house. Of course, everything breaks, so you basically live at Lowe's for the first 6 months of home ownership. But I was going through the checkout line, and it was a former student of mine. And she was like, "Oh, Mr. Tabin, blah, 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 blah." And it was, I remembered her, and she was asking me, and then we were talking loudly enough where another former student who was working at a checkout down the way was like, "Oh, Mr. And she came up, and they were both happened to be 2 young women. And the man behind me, who I did not know, was a complete stranger, tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "Hey, what did you do to get such gorgeous chicks to to be interested in you. I mean, I forget what he said, specifically, but it was offensive. And the two young women immediately eyes were right on me. What is he gonna do? And I did not miss a beat, and I turned to him and I said, well, I know them from a class that I teach at the college where we don't refer to young women as chicks, and we value them for more than what they look like. And in that moment, and the guy was bigger than me, right? But he backed down and he apologized. And he said, oh, no offense, I didn't know, I was just kidding, I was just joking. Right? And whether he was or he wasn't, he has to deal with his own accountability. But in that moment, right, what I did, it's in those moments where you have that decision to be made. Are you going to stand up and be counted, or are you going to fade into the background? And I made a choice. And I wouldn't have been able to live with myself had I let those two young women down, because they saw me as an ally, right? As a man who would stand up and say, not for them, but with them. This behavior isn't going to be accepted, right? So for me, and that's how I try to live my life, whether I, if I'm not, involved in PACT, or I'm not teaching a particular class, doesn't make any difference. That to me, the day-to-day and making those kinds of choices is what's important, especially as a man, because we men have to get together in society and say enough is enough, that we're going to change this. And I believe that's possible.
Oh yeah.
That's totally possible. It's seemingly become less possible in the last 4 years, but we can get back on track.
Hope, Stan, there's hope.
We can get back on track.
The optimism.
Yeah.
So that was a great answer. So the last question for today, is there any advice or any final thoughts that you would like to share with anyone listening or watching?
Well, thank you, Zaisha, for having us and inviting us. This was fun. I really appreciate this. And I love the work that you're doing, setting up these videos and calling upon students to get involved. I think that's great. Right. And there is involvement. I'm also a licensed rape crisis advocate through Planned Parenthood. And that's not an endorsement of them, but there are ways, if you seek it out, you can find ways to become involved.
Yeah, and as I was thinking before, I'm not sure I said it, was to get involved with Stop Domestic Violence, to really understand domestic violence from the target's point of view, the victim's point of view. Volunteers are the essence of the hotline, but not until you're trained heavily, 12 hours of training before you can even attempt to do the hotline. Go to various events and activities. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Wear purple ribbons, wear purple. I love it when I see Hawkins Hall aglow in purple in October, because that's, again, we talk about allies. Yes, even the institution, the bricks are upholding the rights and the justice for women and children. So I think that's a first way to get involved, because I think you have to understand and comprehend that it's not her fault. It's not the 4-year-old's fault. It's not the teenage girl's fault. It's my personal responsibility for what I do and say, and to grow into that understanding, I think you do have to know the degree of injustice that exists in our society. And that
no one allows themselves to be abused.
Right.
And
it is the perpetrator.
Yeah. Well, you could have just left narrative, right? Why didn't you just leave? Well, the education that we provide explores questions like that and say, it's not so easy.
Right. And actually the most dangerous time is when she has decided and actually begins.
Has left.
Yeah.
3 to 4 women are killed every day by their intimate partner, or murdered every day by their intimate partner.
Right.
epidemic proportions. The only advice that I would give, especially because this is geared towards college students watching this, and I'm not going to have a specific political endorsement, but you must vote. People must vote. If you care about social justice, and if you look at the history of the biggest cultural shifts, the biggest paradigm shifts in our society, who did it? Who started it? College students.
Yeah.
They've literally
my generation.
Yes, they changed the course of the future. They have that power. And the biggest way to exercise that power is to become, that can be your political contribution, is
Right.
going, casting your ballot. And again, to do it safely within your own safety limits, but absentee ballots, voting by mail, it's all possible in New York State. So we have to, as much as our day-to-day lives can be about social justice, we have to also live within the parameters of it. And that means institutional justice. And our institutions need some fine-tuning right now. I'll put it that way.
Have needed fine-tuning for centuries, but it's our opportunity right now to stand up, say something, and then do something about it.
Who are we going to be? Who do we want to be in society? That's where we're at. That's the precipice that we're standing on right now.
Right.
Is who we want to be. And we can declare who we want to be through the vote.
And just to plug that, because I sent in my absentee ballot, but make sure you are doing an absentee ballot, please check the status of your absentee ballot. Make sure your Board of Elections gets the ballot. And if they don't, send another one. Send another one, call, double check. Do what you have to do. It may feel like a lot of work, but it's worth it. There are a lot of people who need us right now and needed us yesterday and will need us tomorrow. So continue to, cast your vote, stand up for others, step up to others, of course, where it's safe to do so, but oftentimes it is safe, and get involved. Again, as Bonnie said, Hawkins is lit right now for the rest of the month of October. Go take a picture, hashtag, tag us, the Title IX office or any other organization on campus. Let us know.
Ruth Bader doll.
RBG?
Yes.
Again, do anything, do something. There's something for everyone. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Bonnie, so much.
This was fun.
Enjoyed every second.
Thank you.